Liberal humanism is the beginning of theory because liberal humanism offers those fundamental concepts against which modern theory conceptualizes or philosophizes. What are those concepts? And where do those concepts come from? Concepts were not born in the 20th century or in the 19th century. They were the products of centuries. The concepts, the ideas that we deal with in literary theory in the 20th century were propounded by theorists and critics ranging from Aristotle to T.S. Eliot. You may be familiar with the conflict between Aristotle and Plato over the legitimacy of poetry. Plato rejected poetry in his Ideal Republic because he thought that it created problems, or that it had a very bad impact on the youth. Aristotle defended poetry against the onslaught of Plato. And you may be familiar with his famous work, Poetics. In Poetics, he defined literature, he defined tragedy, and he defined what good literature was. So he offered insights into the understanding of literature. And you may be familiar with the works of Longinus, who came up with some interesting and philosophical views on the sublimity of literary works. You are, of course, familiar with the work of Philip Sidney. Then there were the Romanticists. Before the Romanticists, there were other critics like Ben Jonson and Dr. Johnson. They also offered insights into the study of literature. They also offered insights which are of paramount significance when we deal with the complex concepts of literary theory in the 20th century. You are familiar with the works of Shelley, Coleridge, William Wordsworth, and John Keats. You are also familiar with the works of Matthew Arnold and T.S. Eliot. These critics are authors in different times, talked about literature, talked about the controversies that existed from time to time. They give us insights. Those insights were enlarged in the 20th century. Those insights were summed up, and the name given to the summary of those insights is known as liberal humanism. Liberal humanism formally began in 1840 with F.D. Maurice. F.D. Maurice was the first critic who stressed the importance of language in the study of literature. Then in 1929, F.R. Lewis did the same thing. He also stressed the importance of language. And this was the beginning of liberal humanism. Liberal humanism is also known as new criticism in America. But why is it called liberal humanism? It's called liberal humanism because the central authority for liberal humanists, or for critics who adhere to this philosophy of liberal humanism, this school of thought, are those who think that man is the center of the universe, that man has got a unique essence, that man has got an individuality, and that man has got a nature which is unchanging. It is in this sense that liberal humanism is called liberal humanism. What are the points, what are the tenets, what are the concepts that liberal humanism propounds? How are they important? And how are they the points or the concepts which actually give rise to many controversies in the 20th century? The first important tenet of liberal humanism is that good literature is not for an age, but for all ages or all time. You may be familiar with this phrase. This was the sentence and phrase used by Ben Jonson for William Shakespeare. That William Shakespeare's plays or dramas are not for an age, but for all ages, for all time. This is the first important tenet of liberal humanism, concept of liberal humanism. Good literature transcends its time. Good literature goes beyond the limitations of its time. Good literature goes beyond the peculiarities of the historical time, the cultural context in which it was written. Literature that doesn't go beyond its time. Literature that doesn't transcend the limitations and peculiarities of its time is not good literature according to liberal humanism. This is the first important tenet of liberal humanism. The second important tenet of liberal humanism is that a literary work, a literary text, a novel, a drama, a poem contains its own meaning within itself. It's the logical consequence of the first tenet. We need not study the historical context, the socio-political context, the cultural context, and the literary context of a literary work. We have to study the work as in itself it really is, as Matthew Arnold says. It is obvious that it is the impact of science, it is the impact of empiricism. It is the impact of John Locke, who came up with the revolutionary idea that our mind was a tabula rasa. It was a blank slate. It was against the long established philosophical view of a priori knowledge. The rationalists or the philosophers had believed for centuries that we were born with a priori knowledge, that we were born with certain concepts in mind, that those concepts were a priori. By a priori is meant that they were not acquired through experience, that they were already there in our mind when we were born. This was the view held by the rationalists. This was the view held by Plato. This was the view held by Descartes. This was the view held by other rationalist philosophers. John Locke rejected this view and came up with the view that we derive knowledge through our sensory experience, and this was called empiricism, which is the base of science. So here you can clearly see that there is an impact of empiricist thinking on the tenets of liberal humanism, on the thinking of the liberal humanists, that we should study the object as in itself it really is a scientific view. Science studies an object in a laboratory. It doesn't take into consideration the historical context, the political context, the social context, or the cultural context into consideration. It sees only the object, and on the basis of that study, it derives knowledge, which is a knowledge based on experience. So we can clearly see that there is an impact of scientific thinking on the philosophy of liberal humanism. Another important tenet of liberal humanism is that and it is also a logical consequence of the second tenet that I just discussed, that the work of art should be studied in isolation. that we should not focus on the background of a literary work, that we should not have any preconceived ideas. You know, there is a prejudice against ideas when it comes to liberal humanism, because the liberal humanists think that all ideas are preconceived ideas or notions. And this is also the impact of scientific thinking. When you have an idea in mind, and when you read a piece of work, when you read a literary work, there is this danger that the idea may come between you and the literary work. And liberal humanists fear this. They don't want any interference of preconceived notions or ideas in this relationship between reader and literary work. That is why it is one of the most important tenets of liberal humanism that we should study a work of art in isolation. The fourth important notion or tenet of liberal humanism is that human nature is unchanging. I just explained that it is for this reason that liberal humanism is called liberal humanism, because it believes that we have got a nature which is unchanging, and literature should focus on that nature. When Ben Jonson said that William Shakespeare's works are not for an age but for all time, he meant that there was a fundamental human nature which was unchanging, which was the same in the 21st century, in the 18th century, in the 15th century, in the 14th century, and so on. So good literature focuses on our nature which is unchanging. This is a very problematic concept, a very problematic notion. Because later on, modern theories like structuralism, postmodernism, post-colonialism rejects this notion of universality in the form of human nature, saying that this was a European notion meant to establish European hegemony over the world. I'm not going into the detail of that. Later on, when we discuss modernism, postmodernism, or post-colonialism, I'll discuss how universality is problematic. In the context of literature, you may have heard about Dr. Johnson, Samuel Richard Johnson. He rejected a very interesting work of Sterne. The name of that novel was Tristram Shandy. It's a very innovative novel. Dr. Johnson rejected that novel because it was innovative. And why were the liberal humanists, why was Dr. Johnson against innovation? Because innovation meant that there is room for change in human nature. You may have read Charles Dickens' novels. There are characters, and the characters change. A good character becomes a bad character in the end of the novel, and a bad character becomes a good character in the end of the novel. So there is room for transformation in Dickens' novels. Liberal humanists don't like that because they think that we have got a nature which is unchanging. There is room for improvement. Liberal humanists are not against personality growth. They are not against improvement in our lives. But they are against complete transformation, because the notion of complete transformation challenges the view that there is such thing as human nature. You may have heard Alexander Pope's famous saying about literature, that literature is what oft was thought but never so well expressed. It means that there is a human nature which lies dominant, that human nature from a rationalist perspective is the name given to a priori knowledge. And an artist, a poet, a dramatist, or a novelist reveals those hidden qualities or that hidden knowledge in our nature. And this is the definition of literature for Alexander Pope. What oft was thought but never so well expressed. I see this saying in the context of liberal humanism. Another important tenet of liberal humanism is that individuality exists in us in the form of a unique essence. This notion is also connected with the notion of human nature. We have got an individuality. In other words, we have got a transcendent subject. And we have got a transcendental ego. What is meant by transcendental, transcendent? What is meant by individuality? Well, it means that we have got a power that can transcend our circumstances. You see, this is another point that justifies the word liberal in liberal humanism. You may have heard a lot about liberalism. Liberalism maintains that we can change our situation by coming out of our situation, not by changing our transcendent ego or transcendent subject, but by changing the circumstances around us. Culture should not be any restraint. Nothing should restrain us. No system should put any limitations on our transcendent subject, because this is our unique essence, according to the liberal humanists. This is unchanging, and this is our identity. This is who we are. Later on, when we discuss post-colonial literature, we will discuss that this notion of transcendent subject actually justifies is an attempt to justify European hegemony over the world. Pay attention to this pronoun I. In no other language is personal pronoun capitalized. Only in English language is personal pronoun capitalized. Why? Only in post-colonial theory we will try to answer this question. So what is the purpose of literature according to liberal humanists? This leads us to another tenet of liberal humanism. The purpose of literature is the enhancement of life and the propagation of human values or human values. But one thing is important here. Liberal humanists are against propaganda. They are against didacticism, because according to them, literature should not be used for a political, moral, or social propaganda. The purpose of literature is to promote life. The purpose of literature is to promote human values, but not in the form of propaganda, not in the form of moralizations. It should do this job implicitly, not explicitly. This notion of implicit meanings in literature leads us to the next important tenet of liberal humanism, that is the union of content and form. According to the liberal humanists, in a literary work, the form should be fused with the content in such a way that one derives from the other. What does it mean? It means that nothing has to be imposed on a literary work from without. For example, when imagery is created in a poem, Imagery should be such that it derives from the form of the poem. If it is imposed on the structure of the poem from without in the form of fantasy, it is what the liberal humanists don't allow for. But according to liberal humanists, this fusion of form and content could be made with sincerity. But they give a very different meaning to sincerity. Sincerity resides in the language of literature according to liberal humanists. What does that mean? Sincerity is not an intention. Sincerity means that you enact a literary situation. The enactment of a literary situation, which in other words mean literary creation. It means that literary creation is an enactment. What is enactment? We enact a situation when we allow the situation to unfold itself. We don't impose any preconceived idea or notion on the situation. The situation merely unfolds. And this automatic process is done with this sincerity that the artist must have. The sincerity not to fall a victim into the violence of preconceived notions or ideas. Another tenet of liberal humanism follows from this very tenet, that there should not be any explaining, that there should not be any showing, that the situation should show itself in a literary work, that the process of unfolding should be automatic. Nothing has to be explained with an intention. The last tenet of liberal humanism is that the task of a critic or the job of criticism is to interpret a work of art and provide mediation between literary work and the critic. A critic should also be careful about preconceived notions. So the prejudice against ideas is obvious here in the notion about criticism also. That we have to be careful when we criticize a literary work. We should not entertain any preconceived ideas when we have a literary work in our hand to criticize it. So this was all about liberal humanism.